The fate of entire civilizations once rested on seasonal celebrations. This is the untold story behind ancient agricultural festivals, a powerful force that connected people to the land through ritual and belief. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these events were humanity's first complex system for predicting nature and building community. We will uncover why priests performed elaborate ceremonies to guarantee the sunrise, and how a single sheaf of grain could hold a community's spirit. What part of our modern life still echoes these primal rhythms of earth and sky? Those hands, caked in earth and trembling with a mix of hope and fear, felt the first true warmth of spring. For that farmer, this was not a metaphor. It was a direct physical truth. The survival of their children, their elders, their entire community was a bet placed on the soil and the sky. This life or death dependence is the seed from which all agricultural festivals grew. Our ancestors were not just farmers, they were the first scientists, meticulously tracking the world's vital signs. They watched the sun's path across the horizon, marking its slow crawl north and south. They counted the phases of the moon, using its silver light to measure shorter cycles. They learned to read the clouds and the winds, and they studied the very soil under their feet, understanding its thirst and its richness. All of this observation was a matter of survival, a way to build a predictive model of the world. As the anthropologist James Fraser detailed in his seminal work, The Golden Bough, Primitive Science and Religion were two sides of the same coin. You could not separate the practical need to know when to plant from the spiritual need to plead for that planting to succeed. This fusion is brilliantly clear in ancient Egypt. Priests observed the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which is its first appearance in the dawn sky after a period of invisibility. That celestial event, year after year, signaled the imminent, life-giving flood of the Nile River. It was an astronomical alarm clock for the entire civilization. Similarly, the spring equinox, that moment of perfect balance between day and night, became a universal signal across continents. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, it was the cue to put seeds in the ground. These festivals were humanity's first complex predictive models, built from astronomy, meteorology, and a deep, desperate devotion. But how do you bargain with the rain or plead with the sun? The immense, terrifying uncertainty of nature demanded more than just observation. It demanded a relationship, and so humanity gave these uncontrollable forces a face and a name, transforming abstract cycles into powerful deities who could be worshipped, appeased, and begged for mercy. That alignment at Stonehenge was not just a spectacle, it was a critical piece of agricultural infrastructure, a celestial clock built in stone. Across the ancient world, our ancestors synchronized their most vital festivals with the sun's journey, using solstices and equinoxes as unshakable anchors in their year. These solar markers were the pillars of their calendar. The summer solstice, the longest day, was a peak of light and power. The winter solstice, the shortest and darkest day, was perhaps even more significant. It was a festival of profound hope, a collective act of faith that the sun would not abandon them. They celebrated the sun's symbolic rebirth, knowing it held the promise of returning warmth and the next planting season. This was not primitive superstition. It was a sophisticated understanding of cosmic cycles. Archaeoastronomers like Gerald Hawkins decoded sites like Stonehenge, revealing them as precise observatories. The massive stones functioned as permanent sightlines, marking the sun's extreme positions at the solstices with stunning accuracy. This knowledge was power. It told people exactly when to prepare the fields, when to sow, and when to harvest. Some cultures, like the Maya, developed this to an incredible degree, creating solar calendars so precise they could predict celestial events for centuries. Their entire society was orchestrated by this celestial rhythm. The Inca Empire took this celestial worship to its zenith with the festival of Inti Raymi. This was a grand, state-sponsored ceremony honoring Inti, the sun god. The Sapa Inca, the emperor himself, would lead elaborate rituals, offerings, and sacrifices, all designed to ensure the sun's favor and, by extension, the empire's continued food supply. The entire community participated, binding themselves together through a shared dependence on the sun's grace. It makes you wonder, in our modern world of electric light and digital calendars, how often do we even notice the solstice? We have severed our direct sensory link to these fundamental rhythms that once dictated every aspect of life. Yet understanding the sky was only one half of a sacred partnership. The earth below was seen as an equally powerful, living entity. The soil itself was seen as a living, breathing entity. In ancient Greece, during the festival of the Thesmophoria, women gathered in sacred spaces to perform rituals for Demeter, the harvest goddess. They believed her emotional state, her joy or her profound sorrow over the loss of her daughter, directly dictated whether the land would be fertile or barren. This was not a distant metaphor. It was a direct causal relationship between divine emotion and earthly survival. This personification of the earth was a global phenomenon. Across cultures, people revered a powerful Earth Mother, a being who embodied the full creative and destructive force of nature. The Greeks called her Gaia, the foundation of all life. In Anatolia, she was the mighty Cybele. The Inca and other Andean peoples worshipped Pachamama, a nurturing yet formidable goddess who controlled planting and harvests. To these cultures, the earth was not an inert resource to be exploited. It was a sacred being with whom one maintained a relationship. As the mythologist Joseph Campbell explored this world, you also gave rise to the powerful archetype of the dying and reviving god. Figures like Egypt's Osiris, dismembered and resurrected, or the beautiful Adonis in Greek myth, killed only to be reborn, were divine mirrors of the agricultural cycle. The seed must be buried and seemingly perish in the dark earth before it can sprout anew. These myths provided a spiritual framework for the brutal, beautiful truth of ecology. They explained why life emerged from death and decay. This belief system demanded reciprocity. You could not simply take from the earth, you had to give back to replenish its spirit. This led to specific, meaningful offerings. The very first sheaf of grain harvested, or the most perfect fruits, were often returned to the soil as a gift of thanks, a symbolic repayment for the energy spent. In some traditions, offerings were buried to directly feed the earth's vitality. The most profound expression of this was the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece. For nearly 2,000 years, initiates underwent secret rites dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. While the exact rituals remain unknown, scholars believe they involved a powerful, immersive reenactment of the goddess's story, her descent into the underworld and her cyclical return. Participants did not just hear about rebirth, they experienced it, and in doing so, they were promised both profound spiritual insight and the guarantee of agricultural abundance for the coming year. This sacred perspective raises a compelling question for our time. Did viewing the earth as a conscious, divine being lead to more sustainable practices? When a forest is the hair of a goddess and a river her blood, you tread more carefully. This reverence created an inherent ecological ethic, an understanding that human survival was woven into the health of a living world. With the earth properly honored through ritual and offering, the community could then turn to the most critical act of all, the moment of potential itself, the planting of the seed. The moment the seed left the hand and entered the earth was a sacred transaction. In ancient Mesopotamia, as the first grains were scattered into the waiting soil, the air would thicken with chanting. Dancers moved in patterns mimicking falling rain and growing stalks, while villagers carefully buried small clay figurines shaped like fat, healthy livestock alongside the precious seeds. This was not mere celebration. It was a deliberate act of sympathetic magic, a profound attempt to influence the cosmos through imitation. The pioneering anthropologist Sir James Frazer identified this as the law of similarity. The core principle is beautifully simple. Like produces like, by performing a small, controlled action that resembled a desired large-scale event, our ancestors believed they could compel nature to follow their script. Scattering seeds while chanting for rain was an invocation. Burying a clay animal was a prayer for the health of the real herd. Every gesture was a desperate, hopeful command to the universe. This principle was embedded in the very fabric of sowing rituals. Spiritual leaders, from village elders to powerful priests, would first bless the seed stock itself, imbuing those dry kernels with divine potential. Specific chants were recited, not just random songs, but precise words believed to carry the power of growth and protection within their rhythms. These ceremonies were also defensive. The world was filled with invisible threats, malevolent spirits that could cause blight, invite pests, or steal the nourishing rains. Elaborate rituals were performed at the field's boundaries to ward off these forces, creating a sacred, protected space for the seeds to sprout. The Roman festival of Robigalia is a stark example of this protective magic. Each April, to protect the young wheat from a devastating fungal disease called red rust, a procession would travel to a grove sacred to the rust god Robigus. There they would sacrifice a red dog, its color mirroring the destructive redness of the blight. The logic was direct and brutal. By offering a symbol of the disease, they hoped to appease the god and spare the actual crops. This deep-seated need to participate actively in the growth process makes you wonder about our own time. How much of our modern agricultural abundance is purely a product of soil science and genetic engineering, and how much is still rooted in that ancient psychological confidence? Today, a farmer trusts in certified seed and precise fertilizer, just as an ancient farmer trusted in blessed seed and protective chants. Both are acts of faith in a system designed to reduce the terrifying uncertainty of nature. Once the seeds were safely in the ground, charged with ritual and hope, the most difficult phase began. The community could do nothing but wait, watching the silent earth for the first fragile signs of green. That silent waiting was the most agonizing part of the year. In villages across ancient China, the weeks after planting were not a time of rest but of deep, collective anxiety. They held festivals, yes, but these were not celebrations. They were desperate petitions, filled with dances meant to mimic falling rain and theatrical performances staged not for human enjoyment, but to entertain the gods, to keep their favor during this unbearably vulnerable period. These were festivals of petition and patience, humanity's attempt to actively nurture the young, unseen crops. They functioned as a form of communal insurance against the ever-present threats of drought, flood, and disease. A Babylonian text describing their grand Akitu festival reveals this logic perfectly. The king would be ritually humbled before the statue of the god Marduk, his face slapped by the high priest, a powerful act meant to demonstrate his unworthiness. Only after this symbolic cleansing could he grasp the god's hand, reaffirming his sacred role as the people's intermediary. The entire ceremony was designed to secure divine favor for the nation's welfare, ensuring the rivers would flood predictably and the fields would flourish. These petitions took many forms across the ancient world. Sacred statues of gods and goddesses were often carried in solemn processions directly through the fields, a practice believed to bless the land with their physical presence. Communities practiced collective abstinence, avoiding certain foods or activities to purify themselves, believing that moral or spiritual corruption in the village could directly harm the tender shoots pushing through the soil. But these events were more than just spiritual appeals. They served a crucial social function. With food stores at their lowest ebb before the harvest, these festivals often involved the communal redistribution of grain and resources, ensuring no one starved during the lean weeks. They maintained morale, binding the community together with shared purpose and hope in the face of uncertainty. The Greek festival of Anthesteria presents a particularly powerful case study. This was a complex three-day event that combined the joy of the new wine with a deep, solemn reverence for the dead. On one day, people would open new wine jars and celebrate. On another, they would cook a special pottage of seeds and offer it to the chthonic or underworld deities, particularly Hermes. Most strikingly, they believed the spirits of the dead returned to walk among the living during this time. Households would perform rituals to appease these spirits, offering them meals and then hastily marking their doors with pitch to banish them again. Why this focus on the dead during a festival so tied to growth? The logic was profound. The ancestors were seen as powerful forces residing within the earth itself. Their benevolence was essential. A restless, angry spirit could easily poison the roots of the crops or sour the rain. By honoring them, the living community sought to ensure their cooperation, securing the fertility of the land from the world below, just as they petitioned the gods in the world above. It makes us wonder, in our modern age of weather satellites and computerized irrigation, have we truly eliminated the need for such collective acts of hope and supplication? Or have we simply internalized that anxiety, losing the communal rituals that once gave it voice and purpose? This long, tense interval of waiting and pleading found its ultimate release in the most critical and joyous event of the entire year, the harvest. That successful harvest, the one the entire village had prayed and waited for, arrived with a shadow. In a Celtic village, as the golden fields stood ready, the first sickle cut was not made by a cheering farmer. It was a solemn, almost fearful act performed by an elder with precise ritual, for they believed that the first sheaf of grain to fall contained the spirit of the corn itself, a powerful, conscious force that animated the entire crop. To harvest it carelessly was to risk offending this spirit, potentially dooming the next year's growth. This was the fourth and perhaps most psychologically complex practice, the customs and taboos surrounding the harvest. The act of reaping was not seen as a simple gathering of food. It was a kind of sacred violence, the necessary killing of the plant's life force so that the community could live. Folklorists who studied these traditions across Europe identified a near-universal figure, the Corn Mother or the Corn Spirit. This being was not a distant goddess in the sky, but an immanent presence dwelling within the very stalks. As the harvest progressed, this spirit was believed to retreat, concentrating its power into the final, uncut sheaf standing alone in the field. The treatment of this last sheaf was a matter of grave importance. In some regions, it was carefully woven into a human-like shape, a dolly that represented the Corn Mother herself. This effigy was then carried back to the village with honor and preserved in a barn or a home until the next planting season. The spirit's safekeeping guaranteed its return to the fields when the new seeds were sown. This logic of reciprocity extended to the very beginning of the harvest as well, through the offering of the first fruits. Before anyone in the community could taste the new grain or fruit, a symbolic portion of the very first yield was set aside. This was not merely an act of gratitude. It was a contractual obligation, a payment owed to the gods or the ancestral spirits for their role in the growth. To consume the first fruits yourself was a profound act of greed, a theft from the divine that could break the cycle of abundance. This sacred transaction was surrounded by a web of specific, practical taboos designed to protect the vulnerable harvest. There were often strict prohibitions against whistling in the fields, as the high-pitched sound was thought to attract malevolent spirits or ill winds that could damage the grain. In many communities, the reapers worked in a tense, ritual silence, believing that loud talking or laughter could startle the corn spirit away. The rules were a form of spiritual safety protocol, governing everything from how the scythe was swung to who was allowed to even touch the first sheaf. A powerful illustration of this practice survives to this day in the Jewish festival of Shavuot. While now a celebration of the giving of the Torah, its ancient roots are deeply agricultural. It was known as the Festival of Weeks, marking the end of the wheat harvest. Pilgrims would journey to the temple in Jerusalem, not empty-handed, but carrying baskets filled with the very first ripe figs, grapes, and grains from their land. These were the first fruits, a tangible offering of thanks presented to the priests. This ritual perfectly captures the ancient mindset, a direct and physical giving back of the land's initial bounty. It forces a difficult question about our own time. In our world of industrial combines that strip thousands of acres in a day, has the harvest been stripped of its sacred meaning? We have gained incredible efficiency, but we may have lost that palpable sense of reciprocity, the feeling that we are partners in a cycle with the land, not just its masters. With the last sheaf gathered and the first fruits duly offered, the immense tension of the entire agricultural year finally snapped. The granaries were full. The contract with the divine was fulfilled, and at last the community could give itself over to the fifth and final practice, the pure, explosive celebration of the harvest home. That final sheaf gathered and the first fruits offered released a tidal wave of collective relief. The entire community, from the most powerful elder to the youngest child, poured this energy into a single, vital act, the communal feast. In an ancient Egyptian town, after the life-giving Nile flood receded and the rich, black soil was ready for planting, you would witness a remarkable sight. The pharaoh, a living god, and the laborers who moved the earth with their hands sat together sharing bread and beer. For a brief, sacred time, the rigid walls of social hierarchy dissolved. This was not an accident. It was a core function of the harvest celebration, a deliberate creation of what anthropologist Victor Turner called communitas. Communitas is a powerful sense of unity and shared humanity that emerges when people step outside their normal social roles. These festivals created a liminal space, a threshold period where the usual rules were suspended. In this unstructured community, a farmer could look a noble in the eye, and for a moment they were simply two people grateful for the same bounty. This social leveling served profound practical purposes. The elite, who often funded these massive feasts, engaged in a form of wealth redistribution, reinforcing their leadership by demonstrating generosity. For the entire community, sharing food from the same harvest strengthened the bonds of mutual dependence, reminding everyone that their survival was a collective enterprise. It also provided a safe, controlled release for the social tensions that built up over the year. The Roman festival of Saturnalia is the ultimate example of this sanctioned inversion. For several days in December, masters would serve meals to their slaves, and gambling, normally restricted, was permitted in public. Social roles were not just relaxed, they were deliberately turned upside down, allowing a pressure valve to release before the normal order reasserted itself. The food and drink themselves were central to this experience. This was not everyday sustenance. In ancient Sumer, they brewed special batches of rich, cloudy barley beer. In Rome, they spiced their wine with honey and herbs. These were celebratory foods, markers of a time set apart from the mundane. The feast was also the stage for powerful performances. Communities would reenact the story of the harvest, from the planting of the seed to the triumph of the gathering, transforming their shared labor into myth right before their eyes. This makes us reflect on our own modern holidays. Do our Thanksgiving dinners or New Year's celebrations truly create this kind of raw, unstructured communitas where social status melts away? Or have our festivities become so commercialized and privately stratified that they reinforce our separateness rather than dissolve it? The ancient feast was a ritual of reintegration, preparing the community, now united and refreshed, to face the cycle of the year once more. The masks they wore were not for disguise but for transformation. On the slopes of the Athenian Acropolis during the city Dionysia, an actor donning the face of the god Dionysus ceased to be a mere performer. He became a vessel for the divine spirit of the vine, his struggles and triumphs on stage directly influencing the vitality of the coming harvest. This was the sixth and perhaps most profound practice, ritual theater, where myth was not simply told but physically enacted to secure the world's renewal. These performances were a sacred technology, a community's way of participating directly in the cosmic drama of life, death, and rebirth. The great philosopher Aristotle later called this process catharsis, a purging of pity and fear. For an ancient farmer watching a tragedy about a fallen hero, this emotional release was a way to collectively expel the deep-seated anxieties about drought, blight, and starvation that haunted their lives. The stories they chose were never arbitrary. The tale of Demeter's grief and Persephone's cyclical return from the underworld gave narrative meaning to the barren winter and the joyful spring. The myth of Dionysus, torn apart and reborn, mirrored the brutal process of the grape harvest, the crushing of the fruit, and the miraculous fermentation into wine. These were not just plays, they were explanations and interventions all at once. Every element of the performance was designed to bridge the human and divine realms. The exaggerated masks allowed actors to embody gods and spirits, their features visible even from the highest seats. Hypnotic music and precisely choreographed dances, often mimicking the growth of plants or the movements of animals, worked in concert to alter the participant's state of mind, creating a collective trance where the symbolic became real. The ultimate expression of this was likely found in the secret rites of the Eleusinian mysteries. While the details are lost, scholars believe initiates witnessed a powerful sacred pageant, a ritual drama that reenacted the story of Demeter and Persephone. By experiencing the goddess's descent into darkness and her glorious return, participants did not just learn about rebirth, they underwent it themselves, securing both personal spiritual salvation and, crucially, the agricultural abundance of the entire community for the year to come. It forces a compelling parallel with our own time. Has the communal cinema or the streaming series replaced the ritual theater? We still gather, though now in the dark before a screen, to watch stories of apocalypse and survival, of loss and redemption, processing our collective fears about climate change or pandemics through narrative. Yet one vital element is often missing, the direct participatory belief that our witnessing actively shapes the world. These ancient performances did more than just purge anxiety, they forged a powerful, shared identity, often in direct competition with neighboring towns. Winning the prize for Best Tragedy at the Dionysia was not just an artistic accolade, it was a public demonstration of a city's piety and its special favor with the gods, a spiritual victory that promised very real, very tangible rewards from the earth itself. Those ritual dramas were often followed by the thunder of applause and the raw energy of physical competition. The original Olympic Games were far more than a simple athletic contest. They were a core component of a grand religious festival honoring Zeus, held in a sacred truce that united warring Greek city-states. The sprinter exploding from the starting line and the discus thrower launching his heavy circle were not just athletes. They were living symbols of the vigor and strength the entire community prayed for, a human reflection of the powerful, fertile forces they needed for a bountiful harvest. This reveals the seventh practice, the integration of athletic games into the very heart of agricultural celebration. Historians of sport like David Sansone have argued that these physical contests were deeply symbolic. The physical prowess of the champion was seen as a direct metaphor for both agricultural and human fertility. A strong, victorious body was an omen of a strong, productive land. The victor was not just a local hero, he was believed to carry a divine blessing, a piece of sacred luck that would bring good fortune, abundant rains, and healthy crops back to his entire city-state. His win was a collective triumph, a sign of the gods' favor that promised tangible rewards. The connection to farming was often literal. Many local Greek games involved races where young men sprinted while carrying heavy farming tools or even competed in events that mimicked the actions of plowing and sowing. The prizes themselves were not mere medals. Victors were crowned with wreaths of wild olive or celery, plants sacred to the gods, and they often won enormous quantities of the land's most valuable products, amphorae filled with precious olive oil or sacks of grain. These events served a crucial dual purpose. On one level, they were a spectacular form of worship, a display of human excellence offered to the gods. On a deeply practical level, they were a way to train and display the fitness of young men, ensuring they had the stamina for the back-breaking labor of harvest and the strength to defend the community's vital food stores. This fusion of sport, survival, and the sacred finds its most dramatic expression in the Mayan bowl game. Played in massive stone courts, this was not a casual pastime. The game reenacted cosmic myths, often the story of the hero twins from the Popol Vuh, and was intimately tied to the cycle of the sun, the seasons, and the growth of maize. The hard rubber ball, representing the sun, had to be kept in motion, a ritual duty to ensure the sun's continued journey across the sky. The outcome was a matter of life and death for the entire community. Some scholars believe that the captain of the losing team, or sometimes even the entire team, could be sacrificed. This brutal act was the ultimate offering, a payment of life force to the gods to guarantee the sun's rebirth, the coming of the rains, and the success of the corn crop. It forces a difficult reflection. In our modern world of gym memberships and marathon running, have we stripped physical fitness of its ancient communal meaning? We train for personal health or individual glory, but we have largely lost the profound, shared belief that the strength in our bodies is a direct echo of the fertility of the land, a collective energy that once ensured the survival of everyone. That raw physical energy of the games was sometimes channeled into a far darker ritual. In the biting cold of February, during the Roman festival of Lupercalia, priests would sacrifice a goat and a dog at a sacred cave. They would then cut the hides into strips and run half-naked through the streets, striking any woman they encountered. Far from being an attack, this was a desperate act of purification, believed to drive out malevolent spirits and promote fertility, cleansing the city for the year ahead. This reveals a shadow side to agricultural life, the grim necessity of scapegoating. The success of the harvest was not just about encouraging the good, but about violently expelling everything bad. A community's accumulated misfortunes, its sins, its spiritual pollution, all of this was seen as a tangible force that could blight the crops and sour the land. To ensure abundance, this corruption had to be removed. The ancient Greeks had a starkly formalized practice for this, centered on the figure of the pharmakos. As the classicist Jane Harrison detailed, this was not a random criminal. Often, the community would select an individual who was already an outcast, someone deemed ugly, disabled, or impoverished. This person was then symbolically loaded with the sins and failings of the entire city. They were ritually beaten with fig branches and squill leaves, driven out of the city gates, and sometimes even stoned, all to carry the community's collective impurity away into the wilderness. The logic was brutally simple. One life, one outcast could be sacrificed to save the many. These purification rites often employed a terrifying arsenal of sensory overload to frighten away evil. People would create deafening noise, banging pots, clashing cymbals, and shouting to disrupt the presence of malevolent spirits. They lit great bonfires, using the primal power of flame to burn away spiritual contamination. And they wore grotesque masks, not to become gods this time, but to impersonate demons, hoping to confuse and drive off the real forces of darkness. The Celtic festival of Samhain, the direct ancestor of our Halloween, was the ultimate expression of this. Falling on the eve of November 1st, it marked the critical threshold between the bounty of the harvest and the barren death of winter. The Celts believed the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead grew thin, allowing restless spirits and malicious fairies to cross over. To protect themselves and their hard-won food stores, communities lit massive, sacred bonfires. They extinguished all their home hearths, only to relight them from this communal flame, a powerful symbol of a fresh, purified start. They also left out offerings of food and drink to appease these wandering spirits, hoping to buy their peace. It forces a difficult introspection. In our modern world, do we still practice a form of symbolic scapegoating? When a society faces a crisis, do we not sometimes seek a single, simplified cause to blame? A political party, a foreign nation, a marginalized group, onto which we can project our collective fears and frustrations, hoping that by identifying this enemy, we can purify our own community and restore a sense of order. Having cleansed itself through these dramatic, often frightening rituals, the community could finally face the future with a renewed sense of hope, ready to begin the entire sacred cycle once more. That desperate need to see into the future turned animal entrails into a sacred text. For a Babylonian priest, the liver of a freshly sacrificed sheep was not a mere organ. It was a complex map sent by the gods, its lobes, fissures, and discolorations holding coded messages about the coming year's date harvest, the level of the river, and the threat of locust. This meticulous practice, known as hierarchies, was just one thread in a vast tapestry of ancient forecasting. Across the world, our ancestors developed a sophisticated system of divination, an eighth practice that transformed random events into a language of omens, all to manage the terrifying uncertainty of agriculture. They did not just pray for a good harvest, they actively tried to predict it. The methods were as varied as the cultures themselves. Augurs in Rome would climb sacred hills to meticulously chart the flight patterns of birds, interpreting their direction, formation, and species as divine approval or warning for planned state actions, including the timing of planting. In China, the I Ching, or Book of Changes, was consulted by rulers for guidance on matters of state, which were inextricably linked to agricultural success. A cast of yarrow stalks or coins would generate a hexagram, a symbolic code that offered wisdom on how to align human action with the natural order for a prosperous season. The Babylonians elevated this to a science with a series of clay tablets known as the Enuma Anu Enlil. This was a massive, systematic compilation of celestial omens. It detailed precisely what a lunar eclipse, the appearance of a comet, or the path of Venus across the sky meant for the king, the army, and most importantly, the fate of the barley crop. A red halo around the moon might foretell war, but it could also signal a coming drought that would wither the fields. These were not seen as random superstitions. They were a form of early risk management, providing crucial data for leaders. A prediction of plenty gave a chieftain or a pharaoh the confidence to store surplus grain, plan for trade, or even embark on a construction project. A forecast of scarcity, read in a sheep's liver or a flawed sacrifice, triggered immediate action, rationing existing supplies, seeking alternative food sources, or performing more intense purification rituals. The Roman Senate, during a crisis like a crop blight or a strange portent, would consult the revered Sibylline books. These ancient prophetic texts were believed to offer a divine prescription for averting disaster, often recommending the introduction of a new god's cult or the performance of a specific, elaborate ritual to restore the god's favor and, by extension, the land's fertility. It forces a stark parallel with our own time, with our Doppler radar and satellite imagery generating complex climate models. Have we truly moved beyond the core impulse of the Babylonian priest? We still scrutinize patterns, though now in atmospheric data rather than animal livers, to forecast El Niño cycles or seasonal drought probabilities. Our predictions help governments plan aid and farmers decide which crops to plant, serving the same fundamental purpose: to reduce the existential fear of the unknown and provide a framework for action. These ancient divination rituals provided more than just a forecast. They created a narrative of cause and effect, a story that helped a community understand why the rains had failed and what they could do about it, shaping every economic and spiritual preparation for the long off-season. The sacred temple grounds were often just a stone's throw from a sprawling, noisy marketplace. On the feast day of a local saint, a medieval European village would transform its central square into a vibrant economic engine known as a kermes. Farmers, their pockets filled with coins from the recent harvest, did more than just celebrate. They sold surplus livestock, bartered for better seed varieties, and haggled for the iron tools that would break the soil next season. These festivals were far more than spiritual gatherings. They were scheduled market days that capitalized on a guaranteed, large population, becoming the vital hubs of trade and circulation for the entire region. Historical toll records from bridges and city gates reveal staggering volumes of goods moving to and from these events, from wagon loads of wool and grain to casks of wine and newly forged plowshares. This was where the abstract concept of a good harvest became tangible wealth. The exchange went far beyond physical objects. A farmer from one valley could learn a new irrigation technique from a traveler from the next. Readers would proudly display their strongest oxen, creating a living catalogue of superior bloodlines that slowly improved livestock across the countryside. This free flow of information and genetic material became a powerful, decentralized driver of agricultural innovation. To manage this bustling commerce, merchant guilds established strict rules, enforcing standardized weights and measures so a bushel of wheat meant the same thing to everyone. It was at these fairs that the earliest forms of credit also emerged, with promises to pay after the next harvest allowing commerce to flow even when coin was scarce. The Great Fair of Troyes in the Champagne region of France perfectly illustrates this system. Its timing was meticulously orchestrated around the agricultural calendar, creating a cycle of trade fairs that linked the economies of Northern and Southern Europe. It makes you wonder, are our modern commodity markets, with their frantic digital trading and futures contracts, truly the direct descendants of these ancient festival fairs? The core function is identical, connecting producer and buyer to set the value of the land's bounty. Yet in the ancient world, this vital commercial activity was never separated from the sacred. The marketplace buzzed right beside the temple, a constant reminder that the earth's economic gifts were still considered a form of divine grace. That belief in a living world extended even to the forge-hardened iron of a plowshare. In an Iron Age village, the first day of the new agricultural cycle was not marked by work, but by a solemn procession. Every farmer would bring their tools, the plows, the sickles, the heavy hoes, laying them before a druid or shaman. The ritual that followed was not a simple blessing. The priest would anoint the cold metal with sacred oils, and then, in a powerful act of sympathetic magic, he would symbolically feed the blade, perhaps by sprinkling it with grain or dripping animal blood along its edge. This was the consecration of tools and animals, a practice rooted in the animistic belief that everything, even a man-made object, possessed a spirit, a life force that needed to be honored and maintained for it to function properly. Scholars of folk magic describe this as a process of imbuing tools with intention and power. A blacksmith was not just a craftsman, he was a ritual specialist, often singing specific chants or performing small rites as he forged a plow, binding a spirit of strength and perseverance into the very metal. This spiritual maintenance was as crucial as physical sharpening. The rituals surrounding animals were even more profound, recognizing them as conscious partners in the work of survival. The Roman festival of the Forticidia provides a stark and powerful example. Each April, to ensure the fertility of the fields, a pregnant cow was sacrificed. The logic was direct and brutal. The unborn calves within the mother were seen as a concentration of potent life force. This energy was not wasted. The priestesses would burn the unborn calves, and their ashes were later used in another festival to purify the people, creating a direct, grisly link between animal fertility, land fertility, and human purity. Beyond such dramatic sacrifices, there were countless festivals dedicated to the care and honoring of working animals. The ox, the powerhouse of the ancient farm, was often given a special day of rest, decorated with garlands, and fed the finest grains in gratitude for its labor. Similar traditions existed for horses across Europe, where they were brought to churches or sacred springs to be blessed, ensuring their health and strength for the plowing and harvesting to come. This reverence reached its zenith in ceremonies of state. In Japan, the emperor himself performs the Nine Sai festival, a ritual of immense national significance. Using sacred, consecrated tools that are themselves considered objects of veneration, the emperor offers the very first rice of the new harvest to the deities, personally tasting it afterwards. This act, performed with ritually purified instruments, transforms the emperor into the chief priest of the nation, his actions guaranteeing the continued favor of the gods for the entire country's food supply. It forces a quiet but important question. In our modern age of disposable goods and giant, impersonal combines, have we lost the sense of reverence for the very instruments that provide our sustenance? We see a tractor as a complex machine, not a partner with a spirit to be maintained. This ancient practice acknowledged a sacred chain of dependence, from the spirit in the tool, to the strength of the animal, to the fertility of the land, all the way to the food on the communal plate. With the tools blessed and the animals honored, the intense public labor of the harvest year was finally over. The granaries were full, the rituals complete, and a deep quiet settled over the community, turning its focus inward during the long, dark embrace of winter. That deep winter quiet was not an empty silence, but a space filled with the human voice. Within the smoky warmth of a longhouse, a family gathered close as an elder's voice wove the tale of a clever trickster who outwitted the gods to steal the very first seeds for humanity. This was not mere entertainment on a cold night. It was a vital classroom session, a masterclass in survival disguised as a story. During the long dormant season, agricultural festivals gave way to their essential counterpart, the oral transmission of knowledge through lore and legend. Myths, folktales, and simple proverbs were the living libraries of pre-literate societies, vast repositories of essential data about planting times, weather signs, and animal behavior, all encoded within a memorable narrative. The pioneering work of folklorists and oral historians like Milman Parry and Albert Lord demonstrated the astonishing accuracy and durability of these traditions. Epic poems and family stories were not recited word for word like a modern book, but were recreated from a stable framework of key themes and phrases, ensuring the core information was passed down intact across countless generations. These stories functioned as sophisticated mnemonic devices across the globe, from the indigenous peoples of North America to the farmers of ancient Greece. The appearance of the Pleiades star cluster in the night sky was a critical calendar event. Wrapping this astronomical fact in a story, perhaps of 7 sisters fleeing across the heavens, made the timing unforgettable. When that constellation reached a certain point, everyone from the youngest child to the oldest elder knew it was time to sow the spring wheat or bring in the autumn harvest. The knowledge was kept alive by a diverse cast of community guardians. Skilled bards and poets held the grand epics of gods and heroes. Priests preserved the sacred histories and ritual protocols. But often, the most persistent and personal knowledge lived with grandmothers, who passed down a wealth of practical wisdom through simpler folktales, lullabies, and proverbs told by the hearth. The Norse tradition of the Yule log beautifully encapsulates this fusion of symbol and story. The great log, carefully selected and brought into the hall, was burned for days during the midwinter festival. As its flames pushed back the oppressive darkness, stories were told of the sun's rebirth and of mighty Thor battling the frost giants. These narratives were not just about cosmic events. They were a collective prayer for the return of light and warmth, for the eventual thawing of the soil. The stories themselves became a kind of social fuel, keeping the community's shared identity, its values, and its very purpose alive through the lean and challenging months. It compels us to reflect on our own era of search engines and digital archives. We have access to more information than any ancient elder could have dreamed of, but have we lost the profound art of embedding essential wisdom within a compelling narrative? Our data is instantly available, yet it often lacks the emotional resonance, the moral weight, and the deep cultural memory that ensured a story about 7 stars in the sky could guide an entire civilization's food supply for 1,000 years. That elder's voice, sharing stories by the hearth, was just one thread in a much larger cultural fabric. Entire societies wove their identity directly into the earth itself through the 10th practice, the building and maintaining of sacred landscapes. Consider the staggering project of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a vast complex of stone pillars carved with intricate animals, erected by hunter-gatherers over 11,000 years ago. This was not a temple built by a settled farming society. Astonishingly, it appears to have been constructed before the widespread adoption of agriculture. The site may have been a powerful magnet, a fixed ritual center that drew scattered bands together for seasonal gatherings. These very gatherings, centered on shared beliefs and coordinated labor, could have planted the social and organizational seeds that made farming possible. The site became an anchor in the world, a point around which human life and eventually agriculture began to revolve. These permanent sacred sites functioned as what scholars call an axis mundi, a world center or pillar where heaven and earth were believed to connect. This was not a metaphorical idea, it was a perceived reality. The temple, the stone circle, the sacred mountain was the one place where communication with the divine was most direct and most potent. The theories of archaeologist Colin Wren help explain this phenomenon. He argued that the emergence of such grand socio-religious structures was a key driver of social complexity. Organizing the labor to build them required leaders, planners, and a shared ideology that bound people together, creating a hierarchy and a collective identity far beyond the family unit. The placement of these structures was a science in itself. They were often giant calendars carved from the landscape, their stones and pathways precisely aligned with the solstice sun or the equinox moon. A shaft of light would pierce a dark chamber on the shortest day of the year, a dramatic confirmation that the cosmic cycle was turning and that the sun was being reborn. This celestial choreography made the sacred site the undeniable heart of the agricultural calendar, the place where you went to confirm the time for planting and to plead for the success of the harvest. The construction process was as important as the finished monument. The communal labor of hauling massive stones or moving tons of earth was itself a form of ritual, reinforcing social bonds and affirming everyone's place in a collective endeavor. These sites also served as powerful territorial markers, the spiritual property of a specific community that had invested its sweat and soul into the land. The Karnak stones in France present a profound mystery, with thousands of megaliths arranged in long, parallel rows stretching for miles. Their exact purpose is still debated, but they likely served as a vast ritual landscape for processions and ceremonies connected to the land and the ancestors, a permanent stage for the community's most important dialogues with the forces of nature. It makes you wonder, do our own city centers with their grand monuments and national parks serve a similar unifying, symbolic function today? Do they anchor our identity and mark our shared territory with the same visceral power? These ancient landscapes were not silent or empty. They were populated by a complex pantheon of specialized deities, each governing a different aspect of the world: a god for the rain, a goddess for the grain, a spirit for the local spring. This divine bureaucracy reflected a sophisticated understanding of the interconnected systems that supported life, all centered on the sacred ground where heaven met earth. That Roman farmer's day was a constant conversation with a specialized pantheon. For every task, every crop, and every threat, there was a specific divine authority to consult. This was not a vague spiritualism but a highly organized system, a divine bureaucracy where Robigalia governed wheat rust, Pomona watched over the ripening fruit, and Conscius guarded the grain already safe in the storage bin. This proliferation of deities was the ultimate expression of polytheism as a practical technology. It allowed our ancestors to compartmentalize the overwhelming complexity of nature into manageable, relationship-based domains. You did not just offer a general prayer for rain, you made a specific sacrifice to Jupiter Pluvius, the sender of showers. If your vines were ailing, you knew to turn directly to Liber, the god of the vine's vital sap. This specialization made the cosmos feel knowable and, more importantly, influenceable. Comparative mythology reveals this pattern is nearly universal. Nearly every agricultural society developed a core pantheon of elemental specialists. There was almost always a grain god or goddess, a being who embodied the life and death cycle of the staple crop. In Egypt, this was Osiris. His myth is a perfect allegory for the grain itself, murdered and dismembered, only to be resurrected, symbolizing the seed that must be buried in the earth to bring forth new life. The Greek Demeter, in her grief for her daughter Persephone, directly caused the barren winter and the fertile spring. Then there was the sun god, like the Hindu Surya, whose chariot crossing the sky brought the essential light and warmth for growth. The rain or storm god, like the Canaanite Baal or the Norse Thor, controlled the life-giving but destructive power of water. and for cultures that cultivated the vine, a god of wine and ecstasy, like the Greek Dionysus, presided over the mysterious, transformative process of fermentation. This divine specialization fostered a powerful sense of personal connection. A farmer tending a small grove of olive trees could develop a devoted relationship with the goddess of the orchard, feeling her presence in the silvery leaves and the precious oil. The rituals became more targeted and therefore felt more effective. You knew exactly which offering to make and which words to speak for a specific desired outcome. This system also created a class of divine civil servants. The Mesopotamian goddess Nisaba is a fascinating example. She was not only the goddess of grain but also the patron of scribes and writing. This fusion makes profound sense, as the first written records were often inventories of grain, the very accounting of the city's agricultural wealth. The divine and the administrative were one and the same. In India, this concept finds one of its most benevolent forms in the goddess Annapurna. Her name means full of food, and she is depicted holding a bowl of nourishing rice. She represents the divine as the ultimate provider, the source of all sustenance. To be in her favor was to be free from hunger, a promise that resonated deeply in a world always one bad harvest from famine. This intricate web of divine responsibility makes you wonder about our modern worldview. In monotheistic traditions or our secular age, have we simply consolidated all these countless duties into a single, abstract concept we call nature, or the impersonal laws of science? We no longer pray to a specific deity for our apple harvest. We trust in the science of horticulture and the global supply chain. The functions remain, but the relationships have changed. The veneration of these gods was never static, however. It evolved dramatically as small villages grew into vast empires, and as the focus of power shifted from the fertile field to the fortified city. The emperor's hand, raised in blessing over the crowd, was a masterstroke of political theater. Rome's ancient secular games, once a rustic purification ritual to appease underworld gods for agricultural renewal, were brilliantly rebranded by Augustus as a celebration of his Pax Augusta, his new era of peace and prosperity. The fertility of the land was no longer just a gift from the gods. It was a direct result of the emperor's benevolent rule. This was the imperial co-option of agriculture's sacred rhythm, a systematic campaign where emerging states absorbed local festivals and remade them into tools of propaganda and social control. Historians like Keith Hopkins, in his analysis of Roman imperial cults, show how this was a deliberate strategy. Rulers did not simply ban old traditions, they hollowed them out and filled them with a new state-sanctioned meaning. The methods were often straightforward but devastatingly effective. They changed the names of festivals, linking them indelibly to the ruler's dynasty. They scheduled celebrations to coincide with the emperor's birthday or a great military victory, fusing the cycle of the seasons with the narrative of the state. Most importantly, the ruler himself increasingly performed the role of high priest in the most vital ceremonies. By becoming the chief intermediary between the people and the divine, he positioned his political survival as synonymous with the land's very ability to produce food. This process almost always involved centralization. A festival that was once celebrated in 1,000 different villages, each with its own local flavor and deities, was brought to the capital city. Its most spectacular elements were amplified on a grand imperial stage, subtly teaching a powerful lesson. The state, embodied by the emperor in his glorious capital, was now the indispensable source of order and abundance. The local community's direct line to the divine was being rerouted through the palace. The Egyptian Opet festival provides a perfect illustration of this ancient symbiosis. Each year, the statues of the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were carried in a magnificent procession from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple. The heart of the ritual was the union of Amun with the pharaoh's divine essence, a spiritual recharge of the king's power. This was not a private spiritual matter. The entire nation understood that the pharaoh's renewed divine kinship was what guaranteed the Nile would flood predictably, the fields would turn green, and the granaries would be filled. A weak pharaoh meant a weak Nile. A strong, divinely affirmed ruler meant life itself. It forces a compelling parallel with our own time. Do our modern national holidays, with their parades and prescribed narratives, serve a similar function? We celebrate Independence Days and Founders' birthdays, using them to promote a unified national identity and legitimize the state's authority, often papering over complex or contradictory histories. The deep, primal need for seasonal celebration proved endlessly malleable, its ancient roots providing sturdy support for the flags of empires. The dusty caravans of the Silk Road carried more than just silk and spices. Along those ancient trade routes traveled the DNA of entire belief systems, as merchants and mercenaries shared stories of dying gods and miraculous harvests around campfires under foreign stars. This was the quiet, relentless migration of agricultural myths, a process of cross-cultural pollination that reshaped festivals across the ancient world. Historians of religion like Mircea Eliade pointed to the stunning universality of certain symbols: the sacred tree, the life-giving water, the dying and reviving God. These archetypes resonated so deeply that when they arrived in a new land, they often found fertile ground, merging with local traditions to create something entirely new. This blending is known as syncretism, the fusion of different religious beliefs and practices into a hybrid form. A Roman soldier stationed in Syria might develop a devotion to the sun god Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, whose birthday was celebrated on December 25th. When he returned home, he brought this Eastern solar cult with him, and its timing, positioned just after the winter solstice to mark the sun's symbolic rebirth, eventually provided a powerful cultural anchor for the Christian celebration of Christmas. The mechanisms of this transfer were profoundly human. Slaves, torn from their homelands, carried the rituals of their ancestors into the households of their captors, sometimes preserving them in secret, other times seeing them slowly absorbed. Intermarriage between communities created families that blended traditions, forging new ceremonies that honored both heritages. The most powerful example of this cultural export is the spread of mystery cults throughout the Roman Empire. The Eleusinian mysteries, with their profound promise of agricultural and spiritual rebirth, were so coveted that their model was replicated far beyond Greece. Initiation-based cults dedicated to Demeter, Dionysus, and the Egyptian goddess Isis, who herself embodied the loyal wife and mother, sprouted in port cities and military outposts from Britain to Anatolia. They offered a direct, personal experience of divinity that guaranteed a good harvest, an idea so potent it transcended its original cultural container. This blending, however, was rarely a peaceful, voluntary exchange. More often, it unfolded in the grim shadow of conquest and subjugation, as the gods of the victor were imposed upon the defeated. Their local festivals either suppressed or forcibly merged with the state religion to create a unified imperial identity. The old village gods of the harvest were often demoted to minor spirits or local saints, their power co-opted by a new, centralized pantheon. This ancient process of globalization forces a poignant question for our own time. As our world becomes more interconnected, are we witnessing the creation of a new, homogenized set of seasonal celebrations, a bland, universal calendar stripped of local nuance? Or does this digital Silk Road offer a different kind of fertility, allowing us to rediscover and share the diverse, resilient roots of our shared human need to mark the turning of the year and give thanks for the Earth's bounty. That dusty caravans of the Silk Road carried more than just goods, they carried the seeds of cultural survival. But for enslaved Africans torn from their homelands and forced into the brutal system of American plantations, this cultural blending was not a leisurely exchange. It was a desperate, deliberate act of preservation, a quiet war fought with rhythm, dance, and the memory of the harvest. Their agricultural festivals, born in West African soil, became clandestine acts of defiance, a way to hold onto a stolen identity under the constant threat of erasure. They could not openly worship their gods, the Orishas of the Yoruba or the spirits of the Akan, so they performed a brilliant, painful synthesis. They draped their ancestral deities in the vestments of Catholic saints, creating a powerful coded language. The Yoruba goddess of the sea, Yamoja, might be venerated as the Virgin Mary, her feast day providing a public cover for a deeply African celebration of water and fertility. In Brazil, this fusion gave birth to candomblé, and in the American South, to the spiritual practices of hoodoo, both of which wove African agricultural magic, herbal knowledge, and ancestor veneration into the fabric of daily life. These were not just religious systems, they were maps of the soul, charting a path back to a cultural homeland. The scholarship of the African diaspora reveals how these adapted festivals were far more than nostalgic memory. They were strategic tools for survival and rebellion. The rhythmic patterns of drumming, often banned by slave owners who feared its power to communicate, were preserved in the clapping of hands and the stomping of feet during these gatherings. The call and response songs, a hallmark of West African harvest ceremonies, contained double meanings, with lyrics about biblical figures like Joshua fighting the Battle of Jericho, secretly referring to plans for escape or resistance. The food itself became a sacred anchor. Dishes like Hop and John in the American South, made with black-eyed peas and rice, directly mirrored the cooking pots of West Africa, their consumption during New Year's celebrations a tangible link to ancestral harvest cycles and a prayer for prosperity. A vibrant example of this cultural endurance is the Jonkanu festival, celebrated in Jamaica and the Caribbean during the Christmas season. To the plantation owners, it appeared as a harmless, chaotic parade of enslaved people in colorful rags and masks. But its roots were deeply planted in West African harvest masquerades, where wearing masks allowed participants to embody ancestral spirits and critique social norms. The exaggerated, often grotesque masks and the inverted, chaotic behavior during Jonkanu were a subtle mockery of the white ruling class, a temporary overturning of the social order that allowed for a psychological reclaiming of autonomy. This invites a profound and difficult question. Can celebration itself be a form of resistance? For these communities, the answer was a resounding yes. To dance a dance your grandmother taught you, to cook a meal from a seed that crossed an ocean in a braid of hair, to sing a song in a language you were forbidden to speak, these were victories. They were assertions of humanity in a system designed to destroy it. The survival of these traditions is a testament not just to their cultural importance, but to their role as life rafts for the human spirit. This deep, resilient connection to the land and its cycles, forged in defiance, would eventually face its greatest challenge not from the whip, but from a fundamental shift in human consciousness, a new way of seeing the world that questioned the very spirit in the soil. The axe biting into that sacred oak was a declaration of theological war. Early Christian missionaries, armed with a new vision of a single, all-powerful God, saw the Celtic groves not as holy places but as dens of demonic idolatry. This clash marked a profound shift in human consciousness, a move from a world alive with gods to a world created by one God who ruled from beyond it. Theologians like St. Augustine articulated this new worldview with fierce clarity, writing extensive condemnations of pagan rites. He argued that these festivals honored demons masquerading as deities, and that the true path to salvation required severing humanity's ancient bond with a spirit-filled nature. The old gods were systematically demonized, their images smashed, and their sacred sites either destroyed or repurposed as churches, literally building the new faith upon the ruins of the old. The strategic genius of this campaign, however, lay not just in destruction but in clever absorption. Church leaders realized they could not simply abolish the deep-rooted rhythms of the agricultural year. Instead, they masterfully repurposed them. The popular pagan celebration of the unconquered sun on December 25th was rebranded as Christmas, the birth of Christ, the true Sun of Righteousness. The spring fertility rites surrounding the Anglo-Saxon goddess Eosta provided the timing and even the name for the Christian celebration of Easter. Even the most fundamental agricultural symbols were reinterpreted. The bread and wine of the communal harvest feast became, in the ritual of the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, transferring the source of life from the grain mother Demeter to the Christian Savior. The transformation of the Celtic festival of Lugnasad is a perfect case study in this syncretic process. This was a major harvest gathering in early August, dedicated to the god Lugh, featuring fairs, athletic contests, and the ceremonial first tasting of the grain. The church did not ban it, they baptized it, creating Lammas or Loaf Mass Day. On this day, Christians would still process to the church, but they would bring a loaf baked from the first wheat harvest to be blessed on the altar, now as an offering to the Christian God. Some festivals were eradicated completely, their memory fading into obscure historical records. Others were seamlessly absorbed, their pagan roots forgotten beneath a layer of Christian symbolism. And a surprising number persisted in folk traditions for centuries, practiced in villages long after the official church had condemned them as superstition. This raises a pivotal and difficult question. Did this monumental shift from immanent nature gods to a transcendent creator god fundamentally alter our relationship with the natural world? When the forest is no longer the hair of a goddess and the river is not her blood, does the earth become merely a resource, a creation to be mastered and used, rather than a living partner to be revered? The answer is complex, woven into centuries of philosophy and practice. Yet despite this theological upheaval, the deep human needs that gave birth to these festivals, the need for community, for reassurance in the face of hunger, and for a way to mark the sacred turning of the year, could not be so easily suppressed. They simply found new forms of expression bubbling up through the cracks in the New World Order. That philosopher saw not a gift from the gods, but a puzzle to be solved. The wheat field became a biological machine, its yield a matter of nitrogen, soil pH, and selective breeding rather than divine favor. This was the seismic shift of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, a movement that systematically dismantled the spiritual framework of the harvest. Thinkers like Francis Bacon explicitly called for humanity to conquer and master nature, to wrench her secrets from her through rigorous experiment and reason. The world was no longer a sacred text written by gods, but a complex clockwork whose mechanisms could be understood, predicted, and optimized. This new paradigm did not just change how people farmed, it changed how they thought. The communal anxiety that once fueled a desperate prayer to Robigalia, the Roman god of wheat rust, could now be addressed with a new copper-based fungicide. The success of the harvest was no longer a fickle act of grace from a temperamental deity, but the logical outcome of applying correct principles. This material, cause and effect understanding led directly to the decline of the old religious festivals. Why stage an elaborate, days-long ceremony to beg a goddess for fertility when you could simply plant a turnip crop to replenish the soil? The focus of communal gathering began to shift from the temple to the exhibition hall. The agricultural show emerged as the new secular festival. These were not events of supplication, but of demonstration and competition. Farmers gathered not to honor Demeter, but to admire a new, efficient seed drill, to examine prize-winning sheep bred for thicker wool, and to learn about the latest theories of crop rotation from a printed pamphlet. The establishment of the Royal Agricultural Society of England in 1838 perfectly encapsulates this new ethos. Its mission was the improvement of British agriculture through science, not sacrifice. It published journals, funded research, and held annual shows that became pilgrimages for a new kind of believer, the progressive farmer. This revolution in thought was supercharged by a revolution in technology, the printing press. For centuries, the elders' oral tales were the living library of farming wisdom, a fragile chain of memory. Now, a single printed book on animal husbandry or soil management could distribute that knowledge uniformly and permanently, making the community's reliance on a single storyteller obsolete. The localized, idiosyncratic knowledge of the village was being standardized and replaced by a universally applicable science. This invites a difficult and enduring question. By stripping the harvest of its divine mystery, by reducing the living earth to a set of chemical processes, have we become more effective stewards of the land? We gained an incredible power to manipulate nature for our benefit, but we may have lost the innate reverence, the sacred caution, that once prevented its reckless exploitation. The old festivals, with their offerings to the Earth Mother, encoded a principle of reciprocity that industrial agriculture would often ignore. Yet the human need for community and celebration proved remarkably adaptable. The essence of the harvest home, the joy and relief of a successful yield, did not vanish. It was simply repackaged for a new, urbanizing world, finding expression in county fairs that mixed carnival rides with prize pumpkins, a secular echo of our most ancient rhythms. The maypole dancer in a field is not a farmer but a software developer on a weekend retreat. This is the nostalgia industry at work, a modern landscape where ancient agricultural festivals are revived, reenacted, and often commercially repackaged for a world that has largely forgotten its dependence on the soil. We are witnessing the creation of what historian Eric Hobsbawm termed invented traditions. These are practices, often of recent origin, that are presented as deeply historical to foster a sense of communal identity and continuity in a world fractured by rapid change. The motivations for this revival are as varied as the festivals themselves. For some, it is an act of cultural nationalism, a way to reclaim a unique heritage in a globalized world. For others, it is a sincere neo-pagan religious practice, a spiritual reconnection to the earth and its old gods. And for many more, it is a simple, powerful desire for community and a tangible way to mark the turning of the seasons, something our digital calendars fail to provide. We must differentiate, however, between revivals grounded in serious historical research and those crafted for mass consumption. One path leads to community efforts that strive to understand the original context and meaning of a harvest ritual. The other leads to a highly sanitized, commercialized product, stripped of its spiritual gravity and historical hardship. Consider the global phenomenon of Oktoberfest. Its origins lie in the public celebrations for a Bavarian royal wedding in 1810. Itself a transformation of older autumn harvest festivities. Today, it is a colossal commercial enterprise, a global export of beer tents and lederhosen that generates billions, its connection to the actual harvest now a faint and sentimental memory. This invites a difficult but essential question. In our search for connection, are we engaging with the true, often brutal realities of ancient agricultural life, a world of back-breaking labor and existential fear, or are we merely consuming a pleasant, romanticized fantasy? These modern interpretations, for all their commercial gloss, are not meaningless. They are powerful evidence of an enduring human need. They show that the seasonal narrative, the primal rhythm of planting, growth, and harvest, still resonates in our souls, even when our survival no longer depends on reading the sky. That global network of farmers sharing photos of ripe tomatoes is a new kind of harvest moon. In the digital age, the ancient human need to mark agricultural milestones is finding vibrant, unexpected life on our screens. Digital anthropologists observe that online communities are now forming the same powerful bonds around gardening and homesteading that once existed within a single village. These are not mere hobby groups, they are virtual tribes creating a new, decentralized festival of abundance that transcends every geographical boundary. The rituals have simply been translated into a new language of data and pixels. Consider the online seed swap, a digital potlatch where gardeners from different continents exchange rare heirloom seeds, each package carrying a story and a connection. Or witness the virtual harvest festival held over a video conference call, where participants from a dozen time zones hold up their prize vegetables for communal admiration. Even the simple act of using a gardening app to log the day a seed was planted and the day it bears fruit creates a personalized digital ritual, a private ceremony of tracking and celebration. This global connection, however, carries a subtle paradox. While you can receive immediate advice from an expert farmer in another country, you might not know the name of the person who tends the plot next to yours in the local community garden. The phenomenon of social farming games like Farmville perfectly captures this modern tension. For millions, these games simulated the entire agricultural cycle, from planting to harvest, creating a shallow but compelling analog of the ancient rhythms. They provided the satisfaction of cyclical growth and communal gifting, but without any of the physical labor, the dirt under the fingernails, or the real risk of crop failure. This leads to a deeply reflective question for our time. Can the quick dopamine hit of a digital like on a harvest photo ever truly replace the visceral, multisensory experience of a communal feast? The smell of fresh bread and the taste of shared wine, the feeling of collective relief after a long season of work. As we look toward a future of increasing technological integration, the lessons of these ancient festivals become more relevant than ever. They remind us that our tools are at their best when they enhance our real-world connections, not replace them. The next great challenge for our species may not be learning to predict the seasons, but learning to balance the digital and the physical, ensuring that our new rituals still root us in the tangible world that ultimately feeds us. Our most pressing crisis today is one of disconnection, a severed link between our daily lives and the living systems that sustain them. Ancient agricultural festivals offer more than a historical curiosity. They present a sophisticated blueprint for rebuilding resilience in an age of climate uncertainty and social fragmentation. These were not random parties, they were meticulously designed systems that embedded sustainable principles into the very heartbeat of community life. The first profound lesson is the shift from a linear economy of take, make, and waste to a cyclical understanding of renewal. Our ancestors saw the world as a great, breathing circle where death fed new life, and every harvest demanded a reciprocal offering back to the earth. They understood natural limits not as restrictions, but as the sacred boundaries within which life flourishes. Modern industrial agriculture operates on the opposite principle, treating the soil as a mere substrate to be mined and doused with chemicals until it is exhausted. The ancient model teaches us that true abundance comes from working within the cycles of nature, not attempting to dominate them. This wisdom finds a powerful modern voice in the work of activists like Vandana Shiva, who champions seed sovereignty and the protection of local knowledge against the homogenizing force of corporate agribusiness. She echoes the ancient understanding that diversity, in both crops and culture, is the key to resilience. How might we apply this today? We could replace generic, globalized holidays with bioregional celebrations that honor the unique foods and ecosystems of our local areas. A city could hold a festival for the first ripe tomato of the season, or a community could reinstate a ritual of gratitude for its local watershed, cleaning its banks and blessing its water, recognizing it as the source of all life. This is already happening. The Global Transition Town movement, which prepares communities for the twin challenges of peak oil and climate disruption, explicitly uses shared meals, skill swaps, and local festivals as core tactics. These are not nostalgic reenactments. They are strategic exercises in rebuilding the very social fabric that ancient peoples understood was their greatest defense against hardship. They are creating modern versions of the communal granary, not made of wood and stone, but of trust and mutual aid. This leads to the second great lesson, the principle of communal responsibility over individual rights. The ancient harvest was a collective endeavor, and the feast that followed deliberately dissolved social hierarchies, reinforcing that everyone's survival was intertwined. Our modern emphasis on private property and hyper-individualism has fractured this, leaving us isolated in the face of global threats. Rebuilding community gardens in food-insecure urban neighborhoods is not just about growing vegetables. It is a practical, tangible act of reclaiming that communal responsibility for our sustenance. These gardens become outdoor classrooms where children learn that food does not magically appear in plastic wrap, but is born from soil, sun, and care. They are the stages for new, meaningful rituals that connect us to our place and to each other. The ultimate question these ancient festivals pose to our modern soul is this: can we consciously relearn the wisdom of reciprocity that our ancestors knew in their bones? Can we move from seeing the earth as a resource to be exploited to recognizing it once again as a relative to be honored? The story of these festivals is not locked in the past. It is an urgent invitation for our future, a reminder that our survival has always depended on the strength of our community and the depth of our reverence for the world that feeds us. These ancient festivals formed the operating system for entire civilizations, a complex code that wove together science, spirituality, and social order into a single, seamless whole. They synchronized human hearts with the turning of the stars and the fertility of the soil, transforming the raw terror of hunger into a shared story of death and rebirth. When a community offered its first fruits to a goddess or a king shared bread with a laborer during the harvest feast, they were participating in a grand, ancient technology for survival. This was a system that honored the land as a conscious partner, managed economic risk through ritualized trade, and used powerful stories to bind people together against the unknown. The forms have changed beyond recognition, but the deep human needs they served are still with us. We still crave the reassurance of the seasons, the joy of communal abundance, and a way to give thanks for the simple miracle of being fed. In an age of climate uncertainty and digital isolation, their greatest lesson is not a specific ritual, but a mindset, a call to live once again in a conscious, reciprocal relationship with the natural world. This might mean planting a seed on a balcony, joining a community garden, or simply pausing to learn the story behind the food on your plate. Every small act of reconnection is a step toward rebuilding the resilience we have lost. If this journey into the roots of our shared history has sparked your curiosity, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe for more explorations into the forgotten corners of our past, and let us know in the comments which ancient festival tradition you find most compelling.